All right, guys, I just want to welcome back to the Everything College Football podcast. Today, me and Nick here in our 2024 preview and prediction for the USC Trojans as they join the Big Ten. Look at this coaching staff. Lincoln Riley, 19-8 through 2 seasons. Josh Henson, his third year on staff. D'Anton Lynn, they finally made the change of defensive coordinator. Moving on from Alex Grinch, was a star last year for UCLA's defense. Previous 2 seasons with the Baltimore Ravens before that. And obviously the biggest headline, Caleb Williams went number 1 overall, won a Heisman Trophy in his time at USC, but no hardware last year for him or for this team. Allowed 48.4 points per game over the final 7 regular season games. That's pretty hard to believe. I even had to calculate it a few times. Look at the USC offense, Nick, and obviously that's going to be the headlines. Caleb Williams departs, and he was the heart and soul of this football team. They would have been a 4-win team if they didn't have him under center. And things are obviously going to have to change for them to want to compete this season. They're going to have better balance. They're also going to have strong quarterback play at the same time. Only returned 3 starters, added 6 guys in the portal, losing 15. But this is a pretty sound unit at the same time. Miller Moss, it looked like they were going to bring in Will Howard from Kansas State, right? He goes out in the bowl game, puts on an absolute clinic, and basically wards off any intruders. This is his starting job. He was electric, showed some late timing. They allowed DBs to make plays on the ball, though, but he was great under pressure, didn't seem to flinch, threw nice balls with patience, shows a nice quick release, has a nice sidearm as well, can really throttle it into short windows, threw nice high-arcing balls downfield, showcases some nice confidence in his pass catchers. This was the most stunning performance of both season. Nick Moss, who has waited his turn a couple of years now under Lincoln Riley in a day and age where guys transfer out after 4 weeks. This guy has waited around a couple of seasons now. His 4th year in the program figures to pay massive dividends after a 6-touchdown effort in the bowl game. This is just phenomenal and very exciting stuff from Miller Moss.
Miller Moss is a very exciting player. We previewed him in a separate episode earlier in the offseason. I'm super excited to see what he can do this year. I think he's got extreme opportunity to boom as a prospect. Looked phenomenal in that bowl game against Louisville. Had a really solid night for him. Was very productive. He's a very, very strong quarterback. I do like the arm strength. I think he's a really incredible player that they can plug in here who has an opportunity just to step in and be really solid in that game. He had 6 touchdowns in that game against Louisville, which is really incredible. Offensive MVP of that game. Obviously, incredible stats when you look at that. His comp in that game, nearly 70% comp rate, 6 touchdowns, 1 pick, 372 yards in a game that we really wrote off the Trojans. We thought they would get absolutely dominated by the Cardinals, but in the end, they were the one that dominated. They won a very big game, and now they move on, and USC has this Miller Moss opportunity to step in. It's Miller time. I think he's going to step in, take the keys from this offense, and be just as productive potentially as Caleb Williams was. They may be a slow start. They play LSU week 1. That's a tough matchup, certainly early on, but I like Miller Moss a whole lot. I'm all on the hype train here.
Moss, of course, that 1 interception was at the goal line, so he certainly robbed himself of another touchdown. It was a bad ball, threw behind the guy on the out route at the goal line. Young quarterback, obviously, is going to work on that. But absurd production in that one game. Looking at the running back room, they add Woody Marks from Mississippi State, a guy who's an efficient runner, who can get to the edge with some good effort, has a good feel as a runner. Plenty of work as a pass catcher, 5'10", 208. Obviously, was under Mike Leach for a couple of seasons in that offense. Has a pretty impressive top gear when running. Shows some slipperiness, hard to bring down. Great ball security there. Quentin Joyner was a top 100 recruit in last year's class. He saw a few touches. Has good one-cut burst ability. Nice downhill runner. Needs to show some improved contact balance this year, though. Amarian Peterson, a nice downhill puncher with bulky size, allows him to be a finisher in traffic. USC doesn't exactly have much of a deep running back room, Nick. But with how this offense operates, they can certainly get good touches out of everybody. But they need to be better. Obviously 134 rushing yards per game. Marshawn Lloyd averaged over 7 yards per carry last year, and it seemed to not really do them very good. Play calling from Riley didn't seem to be all that great either. Obviously, when they had the defense they had, they seemed to play very desperate, and I think that certainly hurt the run game. Lloyd with elite speed, you wanted to see him get more touches. Austin Jones, a nice physical player as well. And the Caleb Williams had 11 rushing touchdowns. So this is a complete makeover here in the backfield, losing the top 3 rushers. What do you make of the running back room they have so far? And what do you think they can be able to accomplish in terms of production?
Losing your top 3 rushers is certainly tough when you look at it, but I think when you have a guy like Quentin Joyner who could step up and be involved as a sophomore, he had some touches last year, 125 yards on the ground, 6.9 yards per carry, and 1 score for him. Then Woody Marks comes in. I think Marks is a very underrated back, a solid add out of the portal. previously at Mississippi State, where he didn't have a whole lot of production based off that system they were running there as well. In general, though, I think he can plug in, and Mark's a solid back that has some nice high upside potential. 5'10", 208, really solid rusher with some good effort. I like that add from them out of the portal. I think Joyner could step up and be a star early on once he gets some nice touches. Former top 100 recruit, very talented player. I think this is a running back room that's a little bit underrated. I think they have an opportunity to grow and develop. I wonder what the play calling will look like this year. If that's going to be, have an impact on that. Will the play calling change a little bit under Lincoln Riley at this point in time? I'm not entirely sure.
I do want to go back to quarterback real quick because I also added Jaden Maeva, who was a really good starter for UNLV last year, was originally committed to Georgia to go be the presumable backup there. They ended up flipping him all the way back out to the West Coast, Nick. Him and Moss both have plus 5,000 odds or shorter to win the Heisman. The books are clearly well aware of what Lincoln Riley's quarterback prowess is, and that's, these guys taking home a lot of hardware. But for both your quarterbacks to have those type of odds, Nick, something is in the water here, and what do you think it is in Maeva?
Certainly interesting when you look at Maeva. He was solid at UNLV. He ends up flipping from UGA, where he would have been a backup, to USC, where he's presumably the backup. Potentially could beat out Miller Moss. I just don't see that happening at this moment in time. But he had some good experience, played that season at UNLV, and looked solid. The books obviously do have something in mind. Maybe they're trying to trap people with those nice odds. I think if you want to throw a couple bucks on Miller Moss, it's not the worst idea in the world. I don't know about throwing money on Maeva at this point in time, but two of them there. If something does happen to Miller Moss, you plug in Maeva, I think you'll be just fine on offense. I think they're both very serviceable quarterbacks.
And whoever the starting quarterback will be has a nice receiving group to work with. Deuce Robinson, he was the nation's top-ranked tight end in last year's class. He ended up seeing most of his snaps, though, out wide, a wide receiver. He was productive in games where he was on the field and he was targeted, possesses a nice vertical high point, great speed and burst for his size of 6'6", 215, 35-inch wingspan. Had some issues with drops, though, but I think this is a guy who's certainly going to get on the field. Him and the other three projected wide receivers are all true sophomores, Nick, and that's kind of scary when you look at a guy like Lincoln and what he can do with the talent he has. Zachariah Branch possesses elite speed, nasty threat in the open field, made waves as a return man. Wasn't able to spring free many big plays on offense, though. Jacoby Lane really didn't see the field much until the bowl game, where he had a strong performance. He also has good high point ability. He's also a long strider with good burst off the line of scrimmage. Has strong hands and will likely make some highlight reel catches this season. Makai Lemon was a top 50 recruit, possesses dynamic abilities, shines in the short area with quickness, strong run after catch abilities. Kyle Ford returns to the depth chart as an outside wide receiver after transferring from the Trojans to UCLA for a year. He's now back. Jay Fair was a respectable slot for Auburn last fall. They picked him up in the portal. Charles Ross, a versatile player who had flashed in spurts for San Jose State. And they also get back Lake McCree, who had 26 receptions at tight end, returns pretty good sound wide receiver room here with tremendous upside. And Zachariah Branch is obviously an incredibly electric player. I want to talk about Luther Burden back, 2 years ago, Nick. We said if they don't use him properly in 23, he might bolt. And I don't think Branch is going to bolt, but he's one of those players I think is going to see incredibly improved usage in terms of play calling and scheming, and it's going to lead to a massive uptick in production. I see a Luther Burden type improvement from Branch this season, and again, a lot of young talent around him as well.
I think you have to use Branch more this year, or he could potentially bolt. He's a very interesting prospect, an incredibly exciting high-end prospect coming out of high school. 320 yards receiving, 10.3 yards per grab, and 2 scores. Also had 9 carries on the ground and a touchdown, so kind of can be used in that trick play, sort of open up the playbook a little bit potentially late in the game. I like Branch a lot to step up and have a really good season. Is he going to be a 1,000-yard receiver? No, I don't think so, but potentially getting to that 800 yards mark and maybe pushing 7-8 touchdowns. I think that's very, very achievable for Branch this year. I think Deuce Robinson's a really good player to return, 351 yards, receiving 21.9 yards per grab and 2 scores. Lake McCray, a really solid tight end, 262 receiving yards, 10.1 yards per grab and 1 score. Where Hudson's a really solid player, 189, 11.1 yards per grab and 2 scores. Lane, further down the depth chart, had 2 touchdowns on 7 grabs last year. Makai Lemon didn't have a whole lot of catches, but has a lot of untapped potential. Charles Ross was really solid to add in the slot as a rotational depth piece. There's a lot of talent here, an incredibly deep wide receiver room, very young wide receiver room, but still incredible deep wide receiver room with a ton of untapped talent.
Look at the offensive line, a unit that certainly underperformed last year. Elijah Page was a good pass blocker in his 4 games at left tackle. They preserved his red shirt, 6'7", 315. He was a top 150 recruit in last year's class. Manuel Pregnon was also pretty sound after coming over from Wyoming. Allowed 0 sacks, but does need to take steps forward in the ground game at left tackle. And you look at Alani Noy, a second-year player at 6'4", 333. He's going to slot in at right guard. Played a couple snaps last year, was no good, but 3-star recruit. Mason Murphy played both sides. Played both spots on the right side, that is. Got better in pass blocking this past year. Only allowed 1 sack. Needs to find better consistency. And, of course, the best name here is Jonah Monheim. Absurd versatility from this guy. He's going to be one of the nation's best offensive linemen. Has played both tackle spots and right guard in his career. He's going to move the center in 2024. Has been exceptional over the past few seasons. 6'5", 305. This is an interesting transition, Nick, and obviously they're very confident he can play that role. And they must also be confident in some of these other guys for them to be able to make that decision, because obviously playing the tackle spots is a lot harder than on the interior. So they must have some excitement for Elijah Page. What do you think of Monheim, though, moving to the inside, playing all these different positions in his career and being good at all of them?
Monheim continues to move around and shows that incredible versatility at center now, potentially. This is a guy that's very versatile, a very strong player, just incredible on this O-line. He moved around the tackle spot, played at right guard. Now you're going to plug him in at center. Center is a bit different than the other 4 positions in the offensive line ranks. Obviously, you have to snap the ball, so there's a bit of a natural learning curve with that, but I think he'll be able to take that on. Elijah Page, I'm excited to see what he looks like at left tackle. I think he can be really solid for this team. I think that the right side is where I have a little bit of concern, but in general, I think this offensive line is in line for a nice improvement here. There are some solid pieces on this offensive line.
The verdict for the Trojans on offense. Riley has himself an interesting unit as Moss waited his turn and appears to be in for a big season with a young group of weapons across the board, but talented ball players that will likely make an impact. Offensive line will need to improve a great deal as you no longer have a magician at quarterback to avoid negative plays. Run game needs to find its stride for this unit to help out its defense and to have fearful balance. I certainly think this is a unit that Riley's really going to cook up, and I think it's going to be an underrated one that really can shock some people. Defensive side of the ball, Nick, obviously when you look at the Washington Huskies, they had an elite offense, and that was the type of defense they needed to get that far. If they had a USC-type defense, they wouldn't have made it to the national championship game. So a lot of people say the Huskies' defense wasn't good. You're wrong. It was, because if it was bad, they wouldn't be there. And that's what USC got last year, where they were just poor across the board, and you figured they would have a Husky-like defense in terms of improvements, and they didn't. They returned 4 starters, added some major names to this coaching staff alongside D'Anton Lynn, Eric Henderson from the Rams, the coach of the D-line, Matt Entz, head coach who won national titles at North Dakota State, is going to come coach the linebackers. Pretty impressive ads. Riley finally got to work. And you look at the unit they have with the defensive line. Bear Alexander, obviously, a 6'3", 313. Impressive quickness, nice pursuit for that size. He's good at stacking and shedding in the run game. Needs to be more of a tone setter in the run game, though, this year. Needs to cut down on the silly mistakes as well. Did find plenty of pressures and pass rushing. Anthony Lucas is one of those transfers they added last year. Saw 200-plus snaps. Struggled against the run. They're glad to have Solomon Tuapapu back, who missed last year with a leg injury. A good add in the versatile Nate Clifton from Vanderbilt, 6'4", 289. A big player is likely going to start the year on the interior. Kobe Pepe, a 6'2", 310. Elijah Huggins, at 285 pounds. Not all that deep on the interior. Other edge spot is occupied by Jamil Muhammad, who was a great surprise from Georgia State. Showed good motor. Nice pure speed rusher around the edge. Does slide his inside gaps pretty well. And Braylon Shelby, a guy they really like after a strong debut season, being a top 60 recruit. The depth isn't all that great on this defensive line, though, Nick. Eric Henderson, though, this is a guy that worked with Aaron Donald, plenty of other talented specimens for the Rams in his NFL career. What do you think he can do, right away? And D'Anton Lynn, of course, also was able to untap some of the potential at UCLA last year up front. How much of the improvement do you see against the run this season?
I had forgotten how bad this USC defense was until I looked at the stats on this page when I was doing my deep dive, and wow, I did the offensive Iowa equivalent on the defensive side of the ball. 34.4 points per game, 121st in the nation, 432 yards, 119th. Their best stat was their pass yards, and they were still not even a top 100 unit in the nation. Just incredibly gross numbers, and really why this team got held back was this defense was atrocious. They're going to have to step up massively this year if they're going to want to hit the heights that Lincoln Riley was hoping to hit when he was hired out west here. Bear Alexander was a great add from Georgia, but didn't really live up to the hype. Did have a solid season, though, right? And returns at this moment in time. There was some potential about him transferring. He's still here, and I think he's still a player that could break out and be a star. 48 total tackles, 6.5 tackles for loss, 1.5 sacks, 4 pass breakups for him as well. Gets the hand up on the line. Muhammad, a very underrated ad from Georgia State, a guy that really wasn't getting a whole lot of love out when he transferred over, but then really did become a good player for this team. 46 total tackles, 10.5 tackles for loss, 6.5 sacks. His top returning player in those 2 metrics. Anthony Lucas, 10 total tackles, 3.5 tackles for loss for him. Decent numbers to return as well. I think this front part of this defense with Nate Clifton being added in and some of the depth they have as well, I think they're a very underrated unit here, and I think they're in line for improvement. Obviously, they have to go up from here, right? 121st against the rush. You can only really improve from there, but I do think they're in line for a nice improvement.
And you look at the linebacking core, it's also going to have to really step up. Mason Cobb, a player who's showing plenty of energy and playmaking ability at times, but had the second most missed tackles in college football at 29. He ranks third in that category, 22 with Oklahoma State. They do have a nice ad in Easton Mascarenas. Arnold should provide a big boost in terms of more consistent ability. He had 107 tackles for Oregon State. He's also a good run defender as well. Eric Gentry has good length, should see the field on passing downs, was much better this past year in run stopping and much less missed tackles. And Rayshawn Davis, just an average player at best thus far in his career. Another part of this defense where, obviously they're having a great coach show up. They should be able to help improve them. And I remember after the Notre Dame game, Nick, I was like, this team's not going to win a game the rest of the season, and they didn't. They only won one game. That was on the road against Cal, where they ended up stopping a 2-point conversion to win that one at the buzzer. Twice last year, the defense stepped up and stopped 2-point conversions to win games. So that certainly is important at least, but they were just abysmal, and I feel like they just gave up the back half of the season, especially against the run. It just seemed every week they were getting gashed. 300-plus against Washington, 230-plus against Utah and California. Struggling offenses, Nick, had no issue with the Trojans, especially in the back half of the year. And obviously, you're giving some more praise to the D-line than most probably will, but the linebacking core also has some big shoes to fill, and that's just playing better football, better fundamentals, and obviously better scheming should help them this year.
I do give some praise to the defensive line. I do think they're in line for a step up, but they were atrocious last year. You were very hard on them as a Trojans fan. You gave this team a lot of slack. You were very hard on them, and I don't blame you because they were absolutely atrocious second part of the season. Teams with no offenses were running all over this team, and they were a complete disaster as they fell apart in the second half of the season post that Notre Dame game. I do think bringing in a former, head coach from North Dakota State to be working on your defensive unit and your linebacking core is a really impressive add, a guy that's going to add a lot of veteran experience. You return Mason Cobb, your top tackler, 85 total tackles, 7 tackles for loss. Can he step up and be a better player at linebacker, at wide linebacker? I don't know if he's going to be able to fully step up. I do think he has some room to grow. Eric Gentry, I think that's a decent add back as well. 46 total tackles, 5 pass breakups, 4 tackles for loss for him. There are some question marks with this unit, certainly, but I think Cobb is a good player. Obviously, they added a solid player as well out of the portal from Oregon State, who had 107 total tackles there last year. Some good numbers. I'm worried about this middle linebacking unit, this middle part of this defense, but I do think the coaching should help elevate this unit just a little bit.
There's a lot of excitement for the secondary, though. Another unit that was just pure awful, and obviously scheming didn't help. I remember against Washington, it was like 3rd and 4. Grinch had him playing 10 yards off, and man, I just don't know what you're doing. But there's a lot of excitement here, especially at corner. John Humphrey was sounding coverage, only missed 2 tackles all year, both coming in the same game against Arizona State. He's a guy with long speed and length. He was good for the Bruins. DeCarlos Nicholson was a good player for Mississippi State. Wasn't targeted very much toward the back half of the season. Was reliable against the run. Jacoby Covington was impressive in the first 5 games. Got hurt and returned in the bowl game. Was highly impressive. Hoping to see the momentum continue this fall for him. 4-star Marcellus Williams likely to be in the fold as well. Some new faces in the safety room. Much needed adds. Akil Arnold, coming off his best career season, was elite in coverage. This will be his 6th year of college football. Massive upgrade with him. Kamari Ramsey was phenomenal in his redshirt freshman season for UCLA. Was great versus the run, only allowed 100 yards in coverage. Bryson Shaw will be back, played lots of snaps, but he's the worst player in sports history. He needs to retire. Zion Branch only saw 140 snaps, enters his 3rd year in the program. Great open field tackler, has great effort and boxes out opposing wideouts downfield. Should really thrive this year under Lynn. And then Jalen Smith was a quality player in the slot. But Greedy Vance, who's been an impressive player for the Florida State Seminoles over the last 2 years, arrives to compete for that role. Much improved secondary. I think they could really mold into a top 50 unit instantly, Nick, because Lynn's going to scheme a lot better, and the talent is an immediate upgrade in all areas.
This is a unit that can get better. I think there are some players here that they added that are really solid. Bryson Shaw returns. I know you're not the biggest fan of him, but I do think he has some high upside potential still. 57 total tackles, 2.5 tackles for loss. Jalen Smith, 75 total tackles, 5.5 tackles for loss. Jacob Covington looked okay in 6 games in coverage, 12 tackles for him, plus 1 pick. Not too bad numbers there, plus a pass breakup. Grady Vance, I think, is a good add as well. John Humphreys, a solid add as well. I do think this is a unit that has some improvement. I think they will be a lot better. They were solid at times, right? 103rd in the nation, the best sort of the 4 main defensive metrics. I think they can be, a top 80 unit in the nation, but is that going to be enough to get this team to the playoff where they really want to be? I don't think so.
Look at the verdict for this side of the ball. The defense looked to play with more speed and length in the spring game. Trojans defense still has a lot of work to do, but Lynn did phenomenal with UCLA last year. A team that was also once abysmal on that side of the ball really improved them in just 1 year for them. The D-line that really lacks the bodies to manufacture dominance, but again, better scheming and fundamentals will lead to improvement versus the run, while the secondary can really take massive strides. And I think the best way that I would describe this defense to people, Nick, in less than a sentence was when other teams ran trick plays or misdirection, all 11 players would bite. Not a single one would stay home. And that was a very true statement, and that is just incredibly poor. And that's something that started under Clay Helton, continued under Alex Grinch, and they're hoping that Lynn can be the guy that puts the pieces a little bit back together.
This is a unit that has to improve. This team wants to have any aspirations of being successful this season. They struggled at times last year. There were players that looked totally out of position. Like you said, the players would bite on fakes big time. They just had players that lined up wrong, bad discipline, bad penalties. Alex Grinch finally gets fired, 2 years too late, in my opinion. Now they bring in some better coaching across the board. Dalton Lynn is a really solid add to bring in for this coaching, for this defensive unit. I think he'll be a really solid defensive play call. I think they added some great coaching staff at the linebacking coaching as well. And I think they're going to be in line for improvement. But how much of an improvement are they going to have? How much can these players step up? That's going to really decide what this team looks like this year.
Well, the schedule prediction. The Trojans went 8-5 last year with one of the rarest talents you'll see in football in Caleb Williams, and now moved to Miller Moss, who was waited his turn. And that could lead to major dividends or be a big flop. But his supporting cast is deep and talented. And this offense will find production one way or another. But the defense needed to show some type of IQ, and with a major improvement in coaching, they should be able to compete in certain games at the minimum. Washington, for example, Nick, it was a penalty. I think it was a clipping penalty that backed up the Huskies 15 yards, forced a punt. They blocked the punt for a touchdown, Nick. The only stop of the game they had led to 7 points. Good things can happen for this team if they can just find a few more stops a game. Unlikely to make a major run this year in the first year in the Big Ten, but if they show great energy on defense, I have no problem saying Riley's going to cook up a masterpiece here, because if that side of the ball can put it together, you already know the confidence on offense is going to be blazing high for a unit that put up over 40 points per game last year. Pretty bold prediction from you as a Trojan fan, none from me. Pretty tough schedule here. You're looking at 4 teams. They're probably going to be ranked in the top 15 at some point, in the Irish, the Lions, LSU, and Michigan. We'll be there for the season opener against, LSU in Vegas, Nick. You have them winning that game. A lot of people probably won't. It's going to be a major test for this defense against an elite offensive line and a great gunslinger in Garrett Nussmeier. Why do you have them winning that game, which en route, leads to 9 victories for the Trojans?
I do have USC at 9 wins. People might call that crazy, but I do think this schedule has some opportunity for them to get some wins if the defense can figure itself out. I do like them to win week 1 in Las Vegas. The line right now is about LSU -6. I like Miller Moss to step out and just kind of be that wild card player that he was against Louisville, have a really strong day. I think the defense will get a few stops. I'm not saying Nussmeier's going to have a bad game. I think Nussmeier will make a mistake or two, and the LSU defense will get caught a little flat-footed and not ready for this USC offense, and I think this will be a game that will have some decent fan support for USC as well, being in Las Vegas, not that far from LA, so I do think the Trojans win that one. I do think they're going to lose to Michigan, Penn State, and Notre Dame. I'm very high on Notre Dame this year. I think Notre Dame has a very easy path to the college football playoff, considering they have a pretty easy schedule outside of a trip to College Station week 1, and then traveling to USC, that is, in the later part of the season on rivalry week. I do think this Trojans team will lose to Penn State, a team that is a really solid team, and then Michigan, even though they are sort of in that rebuilding phase after Jim Harbaugh left, I do think there's a very tough team to play on the road, and traveling to Ann Arbor is going to be very tough for this USC team. I think their offense is phenomenal. I think their offense is going to have a really good season. They'll put up a ton of points, and yes, I know last year they put up a ton of points and that did not result in wins, but I think the defense will have improvement with a new coaching staff. I think Barry Alexander will have a good year. I think Gentry will have a good year as well. I think there will be improvement improvements on the defensive side of the ball, enough improvements to get this team to 9 wins. They're not going to be in the playoff at 9 wins, but I do think they are going to head in the right direction. Yes, it's a little bold. Maybe you flip that LSU result. Maybe you flip at Maryland, at Minnesota, if you want to drop them down to that 8-7 wins range. I do think they're going to get to 9 wins. I think that's right where they are right now. I feel confident enough in getting them to 9 wins. The over-under, I believe, depending on your book, is at 7.5, depending where you are. I like the over on this team. I think this team has a lot of potential to develop and be a good team this year. I'm excited to see what they can do first year in the Big Ten.
Yeah, and people can say what they want. They'll probably clown you for picking SC against LSU, but one thing that's true is that Sunday night season opener always delivers a classic and usually a result you probably don't expect. So I can totally see that happening once again. That's gonna be it for today's episode. As always, Nick, appreciate you breaking down the Trojans.
Looking forward to seeing what this team looks like in the new conference. Lincoln Riley brings in a new defensive coordinator, a nice revamped team, new quarterback play, a very exciting team in my opinion.
Make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe. See you next time.